Evelyn Harper Cole didn't lose everything in a single moment. Richard Cole had taken 18 months to dismantle her life, quietly, methodically, and with every piece of paper in the right place. By the time the divorce filing landed, the house no longer carried her name, the savings had been moved somewhere she couldn't reach, and 32 years spent holding up his world, his career, his comfort, his image, had been compressed into a figure so small it barely qualified as an afterthought. What she walked away with was an old car, a handful of personal things, and $21,000. 3 weeks after that, Evelyn spent nearly every cent of it on a restaurant nobody wanted, an abandoned building with no line of customers waiting, no promise attached. Nobody around her could make sense of it, and maybe she couldn't fully explain it either, not then. But some choices don't come from logic. They come from the place a person reaches when there's nothing left to protect, and those are the choices that remake everything. If you've ever wondered what unfolds when a woman stripped of all she had still refuses to stop moving forward, stay until the end. And if stories like this one speak to you, subscribe to the channel to support us. Because what waited for Evelyn inside that old kitchen went far beyond dust and dark and forgotten things. Evelyn Harper Cole stood at the threshold of the room behind the kitchen for close to 2 minutes. The door hung open already, but her body held back, just enough distance between her and the doorframe, as though one more step would carry her into something she wasn't prepared to name yet. She'd come back to measure the kitchen again, to scribble notes about what could be salvaged and what had to go. The small notebook was still in her hand, a few scratched out numbers, a handful of question marks. Not one line in those pages mentioned this room, but there it was, and she'd opened it. The air inside didn't just smell of dust, something older lived in it, deeper. The kind of stillness that forms when air hasn't been disturbed in years, holding whatever was sealed inside it like a secret pressed between pages. Light from the kitchen behind her reached a few feet across the floor and then quit, as though it too refused to go further. Everything beyond sat submerged in pale grey, chairs broken and stacked against each other, a metal cabinet warped and leaning, cardboard boxes gone soft at every corner, their edges chewed away by dampness and time. 8 years, that's what the seller had told her. 8 years since anyone turned a key in this door. 8 years since a living soul used this room for anything at all. Evelyn could have turned around, closed the door, gone back to her notebook and the list of problems already long enough without adding another. She had more than enough weighing on her without whatever this room held. She stood still one more breath, then she stepped inside. Against the far wall, a row of large wooden crates sat beneath a heavy tarp. They weren't scattered among the wreckage like everything else. They were arranged, deliberate, orderly, as if someone had placed them with clear purpose, then walked out and never returned. She crossed the room toward them. Her fingers found the tarp. Dust lifted, less than she'd expected. She pulled the canvas down with one hand. Underneath were glass jars. Evelyn straightened. For several seconds she did absolutely nothing. The jars were lined up in careful rows, 4 or 5 to each row, more than 24 in total. But it wasn't the jars themselves that stopped her. It was the handwriting on the labels. The metal lids had gone dark with age, but they held firm. The paper labels pasted to the glass had faded, ink thinning year by year, but the words were still legible. She bent down, lifted one jar. The glass was cold against her palm, heavier than she'd expected. Inside, something dark brown with a trace of red had thickened over the years. She brought the jar closer. Her eyes settled on the handwritten line across the label. Blue Porch Fig Preserve, Mabel Louise Harper, Savannah, Georgia. She didn't move again. Her grandmother's name rested in her hand. In the middle of a room sealed shut for 8 years, in a city where Evelyn had never imagined she'd end up. She didn't set the jar down, not yet. She held it exactly like that, reading each word a second time, slower, as if reading too fast might make the ink vanish. She hadn't seen that name written out in a very long time. Evelyn had grown up in the kitchen behind a small wooden house in Savannah, where summer always arrived a little earlier and held on a little longer. Her grandmother never called the things she made products. They were fig preserve, chutney, Glass jars lined along wooden shelves. People came and took them, paid or didn't, depending on the season, depending on the day. Mabel kept few records, but everything she created carried its own rhythm, its own way, its own scent that Evelyn could identify even from outside the door. Faintly spiced, deeply sweet, and beneath all that, some layer she had never been able to name. She set the jar down, then she pulled the tarp fully aside. There was far more than she'd expected. The wooden crates didn't hold just a few dozen jars. They were lined with paper, stacked in careful layers, each row composed of identical vessels. Some labels had blurred with time, others remained sharp. But every single one bore the same name. Evelyn dropped to her knees. Her hands moved faster now. She wasn't standing there looking anymore. She was opening each crate, checking each layer, pulling back the paper. In one corner, beneath the final jars, she found a bundle of papers bound together with string. She drew it out. The paper had gone yellow but hadn't rotted. Letters, handwritten invoices, short notes. One name appeared over and over again: Nadine Porter. She turned each sheet. The dates spanned years. The lines described quantities, the quality of individual batches, which ones needed more time, which had already reached readiness. These were not the papers of a woman doing it as a hobby. This was a chain of exchanges, systematic, regular, stretching across a lifetime. Evelyn turned to the bottom of the bundle. There, thicker documents waited, typed, bearing signatures. She pulled them out and spread them across her knees. Her eyes slowed. She read each line deliberately. The name Mabel Louise Harper appeared at the top. Below it the terms ownership rights, production rights, distribution rights, and one line where her gaze stayed longer than on any other, and to her direct heirs. Evelyn did not read further, not right away. She held that page. Her eyes rested on the final phrase. Her hand did not shake. She simply sat still in that room among the wooden crates, the glass jars, and something she had not yet called an opportunity, or anything else. Outside, kitchen metal clinked softly as the wind drifted through the back door. She still had not stood up. The next morning, she carried the entire file to the law office on Meeting Street. A coarse canvas tote bag with worn handles held everything. She arrived 15 minutes early, sat in the reception area, watched through the glass doors as a line of cars crawled slowly through the intersection. Charleston in late morning had its own way, elegant and exhausted at the same time. A city long accustomed to keeping a polished surface while quietly falling apart underneath. Evelyn placed the bag on her lap, both hands rested on it, still. She did not open her notebook, did not check her phone, she waited. The lawyer's name was Diane Mercer, 52 years old, dry but not cold. She led Evelyn into her office, drew the documents from the bag and began reading them in order, not skimming, not rushing. Every letter, every invoice, every contract. Evelyn sat across from her, both hands flat on her knees, watching the black fountain pen in Diane's hand trace slowly along the edges of the papers, as though she were confirming the outline of something valuable. It took nearly 40 minutes to reach the end. Diane set the documents down on the desk, removed her glasses. Looked at Evelyn. How many years before your marriage did your grandmother register the rights to use this brand? 6 years. You are the only direct heir? Yes. Diane nodded once. Then the core of it is very clear. What was transferred to you through inheritance rights from before the marriage is not marital property, unless there was some later commingling of assets or transfer of rights. A pause. Then she continued. I do not yet see any sign that such a thing ever happened. Evelyn did not answer right away. She listened to each word as if it belonged to a language she had known her entire life, but had never once heard spoken on her behalf. Diane pushed the contract section slightly forward. I'm not saying this won't be challenged. People who are used to winning through paperwork don't overlook anything that can still be dragged into dispute. But if your question is whether this brand belongs to you, then the answer is yes. Outside the door, a printer hummed to life, then fell silent. Evelyn dipped her chin. I want to file everything that needs filing. We will. Diane spread open her planner. I also recommend having the full intangible asset appraised. The name, the formula, its projected commercial value. Right now we're talking about a few dozen jars gathering dust in storage, but in legal terms this is a recoverable asset. That same afternoon, back at the restaurant, the phone rang. Claire's name blazed across the screen so brightly, Evelyn had to squint just to read it. She stood beside the worn wooden counter, let it ring a few beats longer than necessary, then picked up __quote _10__. Claire asked, her voice breezy, casual, as though nothing had ever passed between them that should make either of them careful. Quote 11, quote 12, quote 13, quote 14. Claire floated a string of small questions: the electrician, the permits, whether the water line needed repair. Little questions, unimportant ones, spaced with the precise rhythm of someone filling air for the sake of filling it. Then her tone shifted, barely, almost imperceptibly. Evelyn stared into the darkness, pulling at the far end of the kitchen. Claire went quiet for 2 full seconds. Evelyn tightened her grip on the phone. Claire hadn't said a single wrong thing. That had always been the most remarkable quality about her, from girlhood straight through to adulthood. She never said directly what she wanted to know. She spoke in widening circles around it until the other person laid the information down between them with their own hands, never realizing what they just surrendered. Evelyn said, a soft laugh from the other end of the line. The call ended shortly after. Evelyn placed the phone on the counter and went back to measuring the distance between the stove and the prep area. She wrote the number in her notebook. The restaurant's front door swung wide, then clapped shut. A tall white man in a pale blue shirt stood in the doorway scanning the interior. Mid-50s, silver threading both temples. His jacket folded loosely over one arm. The kind of man who walked into a room without raising his voice, and everyone already knew he was there. Mrs. Cole? Evelyn set her pen down. I'm Julian Mercer. She knew that name instantly. Mercer Table, Mercer Provisions, Mercer Southern Pantry. His face had appeared in food magazines, business journals, industry profiles. A man who had begun with a modest food counter in Macon and grown it into a full chain. Handcrafted Southern goods, premium packaging, regional distribution across the Southeast. Julian crossed the floor slowly and placed a business card on the counter in front of her. I called your law office this morning. Phoning you directly felt a little presumptuous, so I drove down instead. Evelyn glanced at the card but did not touch it. What do you want with me? Blue Porch Fig Preserve. He spoke the name the way a person speaks something they've rehearsed silently many times before finally saying it out loud. Julian paused. His gaze drifted past her toward the empty kitchen. __quote _32 __. Evelyn rested lightly against the counter's edge. Are you here to buy it? No, he shook his head. I didn't drive more than 200 miles to purchase a name outright. I came to find out whether the heir understands what she's holding. She studied him for a moment. I'm not sure yet. Julian nodded, slowly, as if that were the precise answer he'd been hoping to hear. __quote _37 _. He asked if he could return the following morning with a summary of what his team had pulled together. No pressure applied, no figure mentioned, no contract language anywhere in the conversation. On his way out, Julian paused at the door and turned around with a question Evelyn never saw coming. The answer left her mouth before thought could catch it. Julian went still for a moment, then a single nod. He walked out. The door settled shut behind him, a small, clean click. Evelyn reached for her pen again but didn't write. The phone on the counter buzzed one more time. Not Claire, not the lawyer. The screen showed a name she had scrubbed from every routine, but never from her memory. Richard Cole. Evelyn let the first call ring itself out and fall silent. Seconds later, the screen glowed again. Same name. She looked at it without reaching. Richard had always possessed an instinct for reappearing at the precise moment something started taking shape without him. For 32 years, he had almost never walked into a room while things were still undone. He waited until the table was dressed, the guests arranged, the contract drawn up. Only then did he step in, as though the whole scene had been his doing. The divorce had followed the same pattern. Evelyn picked up on the third ring. It's me, Richard said, low, even, unhurried. That voice had once convinced other people he was a man of restraint, of careful judgment, of composure under pressure. Evelyn understood the truth. It was simply the voice of someone who had never been made to pay for anything on time. I know, she said. I heard from Claire that you're handling some paperwork matters at the new restaurant. She motioned toward the counter. Is that so? She's just worried about you. That's none of your business. Richard went quiet for a bit. If there is anything involving old ownership rights, outstanding debt or prior contracts, you should let my lawyer review it before signing anything. Assets discovered during post-divorce proceedings are sometimes more complicated than people think. By the time that sentence ended, she had pulled out a chair and lowered herself into it. His method of selecting words had not changed. He never stated what he wanted directly. He only constructed a frame of language and waited for other people to step inside it on their own. I have a lawyer, Evelyn said. I know, I just don't want you to be taken advantage of right now. You had 18 months to care about that. The line grew noticeably quieter. When Richard spoke again, the voice stayed soft, just pitched slightly lower than before. There's no need to turn everything into a battle every time I try to speak decently. Evelyn looked through the front window of the restaurant. Across the street, a delivery man pushed a cart stacked with soft drink crates down the sidewalk. A young couple passed carrying a small child. The city kept running its ordinary business while the man who had shared more than half her life was trying to lay his hand back on something that no longer belonged to him. I'm busy, she said. Evelyn. She gave him nothing. If a new asset has appeared, I need to know. I'm not discussing this in a personal capacity. You never did anything in a personal capacity. She ended the call. That afternoon, Diane Mercer sent an email. The petition establishing inheritance rights and the right to use the brand had been filed. A handful of items still required supplementation. Those would be completed within 3 days. At the bottom of the message sat one line, shorter than the rest. I think your ex-husband will react quickly. Please forward every communication to me, if there is any. The following morning, Julian Mercer arrived at exactly 10 o'clock, precisely as promised. He carried a thin, cream-colored folder and a box of photographic copies. He did not come alone. The young woman beside him introduced herself as Lena, heritage brand researcher at his company. They did not walk into the restaurant like people who had come to talk an owner into signing something. They spread the documents across the table near the window, the way people open a family file that has been missing for a very long time. Lena placed in front of Evelyn photocopied menus from 3 separate restaurants, 2 in Savannah, 1 in Beaufort, dating back to the 1990s. Next to listings for cured meats, buttermilk biscuits and baked cheese sat small notations. Served with blue porch fig preserve. A clipping from a regional magazine, 1998, described the lightly spiced fig preserve made by Mabel Harper, a preserve that a handful of chefs across the area still quietly track down. A business card from a specialty shop in Augusta had been tucked into the file. Its corners were soft and creased. On the back, someone had scrawled a few rushed words. __, quote _57 __. Evelyn pressed her fingertips against the yellowed edge of that card. She had never known her grandmother's hands had reached that far beyond the small kitchen behind the house. Julian sat across the table, both hands flat. Still, I do not need to tell you this can be sold. You are old enough to recognize commercial value when it is sitting in front of you. What I am telling you is that this carries more than that. It carries history, it carries absence, and now it carries a living heir. What do you want from me? Evelyn said. A real partnership, Julian answered. The name stays yours, the formula stays yours, the right to decide, yours. I bring the production infrastructure, the distribution chain, the legal team, the experience to reintroduce this to market without turning it into counterfeit memory merchandise. And this restaurant, if you want to reopen it, reopen it. If you want the brand and the restaurant to move together, even better. He gestured toward the kitchen, then let silence fill the room long enough for the conversation to shed its transactional skin. Julian glanced around the space. Do you really plan to cook here? Yes. Then do not let other people redesign this place until it can no longer recognize itself. After they left, Evelyn picked up her phone and called Sharon Bell. The old number was still saved. It took 2 attempts before someone picked up. Sharon's voice came through carefully, the voice of a person trained to expect bad news before the first sentence finishes landing. 1 beat of silence. Sharon exhaled, barely. On the other end, the hum of a vacuum cleaner drifted down a hallway and faded. Sharon did not respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice sat lower, not shaking, held tight. Sharon asked for 1 day to settle her affairs. Evelyn agreed. The call ended. She opened her email again and found a new message from Diane Mercer, sent less than 7 minutes before. The subject line held only 4 words. Petition filed this afternoon. Evelyn opened it. Richard Cole, acting through his legal counsel, had formally petitioned the court to review Blue Porch Fig Preserve as an asset with elements arising during the period of marital dissolution, eligible for inclusion in the supplemental division. Attached to the filing was a chain of messages and notes confirming the discovery of the brand and the documents found inside the restaurant. Most of it sourced from communications provided by Claire. Evelyn read the entire petition twice. Then she printed every page on the old machine sitting in the corner of the counter. Each sheet slid out slowly. The stack was thin, but it was thick enough for a person to understand that certain attacks do not need volume to make the air in a room feel poisoned. She clipped the pages together, placed them into a file folder, drove to Diane's office that same afternoon. Diane had already reviewed the electronic copy before Evelyn walked through the door. She did not ask her client to wait in the reception area. She brought her straight into the small meeting room at the back, an oval wooden table, 2 glasses of water, a narrow window facing the parking lot. Nothing in that room was designed to impress, only to make words land clearly. "They're running a double strategy," Diane said, flipping the file open to the appendix. "First track, they argue the brand's real value only materialized after you uncovered it during post-divorce proceedings. Second track, they paint a picture of you hiding an asset that should have been on the table from the start. I didn't even know it existed before that, and they know it." Diane pressed her finger against the bottom edge of the last page. "This isn't about winning on logic, this is about grinding you down. Delay, exhaustion, pressure, until you hand over concessions just to make it stop." Evelyn sat straight in her chair. Every word landed. Claire had given them everything. Even the check-in calls? Diane said nothing more. The paper spoke loudly enough on its own. A chain of messages between Claire and Richard's lawyer had been printed out and stapled into the file. Timestamps spaced days apart, then weeks, stretching from the moment Evelyn purchased the restaurant all the way through to when she filed the inheritance claim. Claire hadn't fabricated a thing. She had simply passed along what her mother said during phone conversations that Evelyn believed were family calls. Diane closed the folder. "The first hearing will come fast. I don't think their side has real footing here, but this won't end after 1 lawsuit. Not unless he's shut down hard right at the gate. He always circles back when he smells something left to take. Then this time, we'll let him circle back where everyone can see." 3 days later, Evelyn walked into the courtroom wearing the old cream-colored jacket she'd had on for Ethan's last parent-teacher conference in high school. Not for the memory. Only because it fit, drew no attention, and didn't require her to waste a single thought on one more decision. Richard sat across at the opposing table with his lawyer and Ethan beside him. Navy suit, narrow striped tie, carrying himself with that near-flawless composure of a man long accustomed to entering rooms where the outcome had already bent his way. Ethan looked older than 37, not in the hair, not in the face, but in the tension pulling at the corners of his mouth and the rigid way he held his shoulders. He never glanced toward his mother. Phone, then documents, then phone again. The restless motion of someone convinced he could still control something as long as his hands stayed occupied. The hearing ran shorter than Richard had planned. The judge, a woman in her 60s, voice even, face revealing almost nothing, read the original contract section, compared the brand registration date with Evelyn's marriage date, Then asked Richard's lawyer directly on what basis he believed a separately inherited asset could become disputed property simply because it surfaced late. The lawyer pivoted toward newly arising commercial value, toward the need for further review given concealment concerns, toward the chain of information provided by the daughter. The judge heard all of it without a single interruption. When he finished, she looked down at the file one final time, set her pen aside. There is no basis. 4 words. Richard's lawyer opened his mouth to request supplementation, but the judge had already continued, slower by a beat. This brand was established independently before the marriage. The inheritance rights belong to Mrs. Cole according to the original documents. The court sees no sign of commingling of assets and no disclosure obligation violated based on what has been presented here. The request for supplemental review is denied. The hearing ended almost immediately after. Richard did not look at Evelyn. He tilted his head toward his lawyer, murmured something brief, gathered his papers. Ethan rose more slowly. A pen slipped from his fingers and struck the stone floor, the sharp crack of plastic against tile cutting through a room already nearly empty. 4 days later, the first article surfaced in the local business section. Not about the fig preserve brand, about the dismissed dispute filing, and the names that appeared in the appendix of documents linked to several older transactions tied to coal development. A reporter started pulling threads from the legal structure in this case into other files. 2 weeks later, a federal investigative office sent a records preservation request to Richard's company. Ethan phoned Evelyn early that Friday afternoon. No greeting, no warmth, no slow approach. Did you say anything to anyone? No. Did you give your lawyer anything beyond the brand file? No. Has anyone from an investigative agency contacted you yet? Silence on the other end. A few seconds of it, then Ethan pressed again, something tighter wound into his voice now. If they do contact you, what will you say? The truth. A sharp exhale through his nose. You always think everything is that simple. No, I just stopped helping other people make it more complicated. Ethan hung up without a goodbye. That same week, Sharon showed up in Charleston. Small grey suitcase, 2 pairs of work shoes wrapped in cloth bags. She stood at the restaurant door at 7 in the morning, hair pulled back neatly, white blouse pressed, and none of the uncertainty of someone arriving to interview. She carried herself like a woman who had already decided. Evelyn walked her through the new floor plan, the counter area, table placements, where the register would sit, where the shift board would hang. Sharon made one pass through the space and asked exactly the questions that mattered. How many in the kitchen? Whether servers would rotate by shift or hold fixed positions. Which entrance deliveries would use. Whether the customer restroom would be finished before the soft opening. Not once did either of them bring up the old house in Atlanta. Not once did they mention how Sharon had left. By late morning, while the two of them were checking the standing refrigerator a second time, Evelyn's phone lit up. Unknown number. A single line of text. I'm Daniel Whitman, Claire's husband. I think you should know what my wife sent to her father. Evelyn did not reply right away. She turned the phone face down on the stainless steel counter and kept working through the delivery list with Sharon until the morning was finished. 24 deep plates, 18 baking trays, 4 boxes of cloth towels, 2 produce suppliers who needed calling back, their delivery windows had slipped past what was promised. Everything solid, everything countable, everything within reach of her hands. She moved through each item until nothing remained between her and that message. Early afternoon, she walked to the back of the restaurant, stood near the delivery door and called Daniel Whitman's number. He picked up on the second ring. His voice sounded worn thin, no social gloss, no careful politeness you'd expect from a man speaking to his mother-in-law for the first time. Mrs. Cole, yes. I don't know what the right way to make this call is anymore. Daniel paused for one beat. I read the file attached in the email the lawyer sent Claire. Then I kept looking through her phone. I think you should see what I saw. He didn't elaborate. He didn't explain further. He simply began sending screenshots while they were still connected. Claire's messages to Richard. To Richard's lawyer, to some assistant at the office, the timestamps stretched across months. Mom is checking the back room again. Mom says there are papers. Mom has called a lawyer. Mom met someone named Julian Mercer this morning. This looks bigger than we thought. Evelyn watched each image appear on her screen. Not a single apology tucked between those lines. No hesitation, just information, passed along steadily, neatly, efficiently, like filing reports. Daniel spoke again. __quote _86 __. Where is she? Evelyn asked. At our house. Not for much longer though. He exhaled. I spoke to my own lawyer this morning. Evelyn saved every image into a separate folder, then forwarded it all to Diane. 5 minutes later, Diane's reply came back. One sentence. Keep everything. Do not respond to Claire in writing. The weeks that followed pressed together, dense, tight, unbroken rhythm. The diner began to take real shape beneath their hands. Walls repainted a pale cream. The wooden bar counter sanded smooth, then sealed with fresh oil. 2 burners replaced on the industrial stove. The ventilation system pulled apart and put back right. Sharon hired staff the way she did everything. Quietly, deliberately. She didn't choose the ones who talked fastest. She chose the ones who looked straight ahead, who listened to the full question before opening their mouths. Evelyn stood at the stove beside the temporary head chef, working through Mabel's notebook recipe by recipe. They adjusted brown sugar by the half teaspoon, tweaked the ratio of apple vinegar, shifted the balance of mustard seeds and black pepper until the taste stopped being close and started being right. Julian Mercer appeared in Charleston nearly every week, not always carrying documents, not always armed with a new proposal. Some visits he walked in holding nothing but a box of sample glass jars, wide mouth and narrow mouth, and asked Evelyn which shape felt truer for the first batch of preserve. Other visits he sat at the window table, tasting 3 versions of the same recipe in silence. Then he would set down his spoon and say the best version was still the one that made a person pause mid-motion. The one that delivered something familiar they couldn't quite name. Meanwhile, the investigation file circle in Richard refused to sit still. The story pushed past the local page. A law firm in Columbia filed suit on behalf of 2 former partners of Cole Development. The allegation was specific, that the transfer and asset preservation structure embedded in earlier deals showed signs of concealing real beneficial interests. Ethan's name surfaced in multiple appendices, his signature set on documents nobody had ever bothered to read closely, until now. He called Evelyn one more time. His voice had gone hoarser. "Mom, you really can't do anything." She was standing in the kitchen, one hand gripping a wooden spoon, the other pressing the phone between her shoulder and ear. "What are you asking me to do?" "Stop them! Make it clear that this didn't start with you, that you're not involved. If I'm not involved, then I'll say I'm not involved. But they're tracing into the old part too. The old part is where you put your signature." Ethan went quiet. She could hear the air conditioner straining hard on his end, a late office, a row of lit cubicles, a 37-year-old man finally understanding that paperwork does not always protect the person who signs it. "Dad says you'd want to see us collapse." "Your father always thinks everything revolves around what other people want for him." Ethan did not call again. Claire called on Sunday evening, just after the test kitchen had gone dark. Sharon Bell was counting glasses and cups at the front counter. Evelyn looked at her daughter's name glowing on the screen. Then she stepped into the backyard before answering. Wind carried the smell of brackish water from the harbor. The sky was not fully dark yet. "Mom," Claire said. That single word was enough. Evelyn knew everything in her daughter's life had shifted out of its old place. Not because regret had softened her voice, because for the first time Claire was no longer speaking from a position of safety. "What is it Daniel knows?" Evelyn said nothing. "He checked my phone. He read everything." Claire swallowed dryly. "He moved into another room already. Tomorrow morning I have to meet with a lawyer." "Is that so?" "Don't talk like that, Mom." Claire's voice thinned, sharpened with urgency. "I was only trying to keep everything from getting worse. Dad said if a new asset appeared and no one controlled it, the legal side would drag on and you would end up losing more." "You're 34 years old." Claire fell silent. Adults cannot keep calling what they do being glad. Forever. "You don't understand." "I understand very clearly." On the other hand, quick breathing, then a door shutting. Maybe Claire was standing in the apartment parking lot. Maybe she had turned her back on her own home to call her mother for the first time, not to extract information, but to find somewhere to lean. "I need a place to stay for a few days," Claire said. "Just a few days." Evelyn looked across the backyard, growing darker. Tomorrow the crates of produce would arrive. "When I needed a place to stay, you did not call." Claire started to say something, but Evelyn had already ended the call. 2 days later, she drove to a nursing home in North Charleston to meet Nadine Porter. The 83-year-old woman was smaller than Evelyn had expected, but her eyes held light and her memory still ran sharp enough to recognize the name Mabel Harper in the very first line of introduction. Nadine sat motionless for a long time after Evelyn said she was Mabel's granddaughter. She did not ask again, did not doubt it. She only placed her thin hand on the arm of her chair and looked straight at Evelyn, like someone who had waited too long for news and had finally stopped hoping it would come. "I kept those jars because I couldn't bear to throw away something Mabel made with her own hands," Nadine said. "When the restaurant closed, I was going to call her. By the time I tracked down the number, people told me she was very ill. Then, not long after, she passed. I didn't know who was supposed to receive them." They sat together for close to 2 hours. Nadine described the deliveries wrapped in old cloth, how Mabel always wrote the cooking date on the lid in her own hand, how she had never once agreed to raise the price, even when Nadine insisted customers would gladly pay more. Before she left, Evelyn told Nadine she wanted to arrange a monthly payment from the restaurant's profits once it opened. Nadine's expression tightened. She was about to refuse. Evelyn said only one thing. "You kept them for me for 8 years." That evening, when she returned to the restaurant, Sharon was mounting the temporary shift board on the wall beside the counter. Staff names lined up in black ink, neat and deliberate. At the very top, front of house manager, Sharon Bell. Opening morning arrived before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Sharon was already there at 5:30, hair pulled into a tight bun, a stack of invoices pressed under one arm, a pencil tucked behind her ear like she'd owned this space for years. The bread delivery came before 6, vegetables rolled in 15 minutes later, buttercream, bacon, cornmeal, eggs, apple vinegar, brown sugar. The first glass jars for the small batch of blue porch fig preserve to be sold right at the counter were carried inside in such precise order that the kitchen, before all the lights had even clicked on, already sounded like a place that was truly running. Evelyn stood at the prep table, apron cinched firm around her waist. She checked the sauce again for the slow-roasted meat. Behind her on the stove, the preserve pot simmered low and steady. The smell of ripe figs drifted first, then cinnamon, then cloves, apple vinegar, black pepper, each layer rising, thickening, folding into the scent of hot butter and onions heating the pan. Marisol, the young prep cook slicing onions at the next station, lifted her head and said quietly, "There are already people lining up out there." Sharon didn't glance up from the reservation board. "The doors open at 11. If they came early, they can wait." 10 minutes before 10, Julian Mercer walked through the front door. No flowers, no wine, just a wooden frame wrapped in brown paper. He moved straight past the empty tables into the kitchen and set it on the stainless steel counter. "I thought this should be here from the beginning." Evelyn peeled back the paper. Inside was the photograph she had lent Julian the day before to be scanned. Mabel Harper standing in front of the old porch in Savannah. A short-sleeved dress, hair rolled neatly up, holding 2 jars of preserve in both hands. Smiling the way a person smiles when they don't need to explain something they know is good. The frame was simple, pale oak, clear glass, no ornate border, no nameplate. Evelyn picked it up and looked at it for a long moment. Then she told Marisol to watch the sauce for 2 minutes. She carried the photograph out herself, to the wall beside the kitchen door, where everyone walking into the dining room would pass it. Sharon handed her the small hammer and the nail she had already set aside. Nobody said a word. The photograph went up at eye level. When the doors finally opened, the line on the sidewalk had already stretched past half the storefront. Some were neighborhood people who had walked by for weeks watching the renovation unfold. Curiosity had turned into commitment. They came. Others were downtown guests who'd heard the restaurant's name through a brief post about a southern kitchen reviving a lost fig preserve recipe. Two older couples had driven from Savannah, only because they'd spotted the name Blue Porch in a small article by Julian. 15 minutes after opening, every table was occupied. Sharon moved through the dining room as though every chair corner and every gap between tables had been measured to match the rhythm of her steps. She adjusted water glasses without breaking stride, pulled up an extra chair for a table of 4. She guided an elderly couple closer to the window because the husband struggled to hear when seated near the bar. The servers fell into a steadier cadence. Order chimes rang rapid across the kitchen. The clatter of pots and pans, oven doors swinging open and shut, people calling out to one another in short, clear phrases that served no real purpose except connection, except the pleasure of being heard. In the thick of that first rush, Diane Mercer walked through the door with a man in a grey shirt, no tie. They took the last table against the wall. Evelyn barely had time to nod, her hands were already plating. Near the end of their meal, Diane stepped into the kitchen, set a thin envelope on the edge of the table, spoke just loud enough to cut through the ventilation hum. Federal prosecutors had officially opened a file on Richard Cole. Several Cole development transactions were now under formal investigation. Ethan was not facing charges, not at this time, but his professional standing was, in her words, essentially finished. Richard had lost 2 major investors that morning alone. I thought you should know. Evelyn nodded once. Thank you. Diane's gaze drifted toward the packed room beyond the kitchen door. Guests were passing around the sample jars of preserve placed in the center of each table, handling them like something both familiar and strange, like objects from a life they almost remembered. You have other things to do today, Diane said. Then she walked back out. Lunch bled into the early afternoon without a single meaningful pause. A local food critic sat alone near the entrance, quiet, watchful, ordered biscuits, pan-seared chicken and a jar of preserve to take home. A group of older women gathered beneath Mabel's photograph on the wall. They stood there for a long time before anyone seated them. One of them asked Sharon Bell if that was the owner's grandmother. Sharon answered simply, "She is the reason this place is here today." Somewhere around 3 o'clock, Evelyn's phone buzzed inside her apron pocket. She was elbow deep in service, couldn't stop. More than an hour passed before the first wave of customers thinned and the kitchen slowed to take out orders only. She pulled the phone out. 3 missed calls from Richard, 1 from Claire, 1 voicemail she hadn't heard. Evelyn stared at the screen for a few seconds, then pressed mute, completely. Set the phone on the high shelf above the spice rack, where it would stay. By the time the last guests pushed back from their tables, the sun had shifted away from the front windows. Glasses collected, cups gathered, the floor swept for the first time since morning. Sharon was counting the afternoon register with the new young employee. Marisol wiped down the stove in long, even strokes. Julian leaned against the back doorway, jacket draped loose over his shoulders. He watched the last handful of people drift out onto the street. Evelyn washed her hands at the stainless steel sink, dried them slowly, then stepped forward to stand right at the kitchen threshold. From that spot, she could see everything, the whole room. Tables that had been used hard and well, napkins still half folded, evening light settling soft across the wood surfaces, Mabel's photograph hanging steady on the wall. Sharon bent over her numbers. Servers laughing quietly with each other after a first day that had never once let up. And on every table, a jar of Blue Porch fig preserve. Lid already opened. Nobody in this room needed to know that Richard had once taken the house, the accounts, the signatures. Nobody needed to hear how many years Evelyn had lived inside a life where her name appeared nowhere at all. This room had not been built from those things. It stood here because of an old kitchen in Savannah, a woman who had stirred figs over a stove many years ago. A stack of papers lying still in the dark, and a door at the back of the kitchen that Evelyn had pushed open on the exact day she had nothing left to lose. Not a single person in that room paused to ask what had come before they walked in, and not one of them needed a long explanation for why this flavor was sitting on their table tonight. Each one carried away a story of their own, left with a memory of their own. And behind them remained a space that went on existing without needing to prove anything further. If you have stayed with this story all the way to here, thank you for that. If someone you know needs to hear it, send it their way. And if you want to keep finding stories like this one, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next.